prepare the audio and the settings ready. And just to mention that since tomorrow we start the first session of another course, where several of us are going to be there too. Um, we were discussing of some of the doubts we had in terms of what we'll be reviewing today and what tomorrow with other peers of us. But just to make sure that we are in agreement, and we're in with a bit of a delay, but just no further ado, I want to say welcome to all of you. We formally started yesterday, module 2 of this challenging and solutions course that we have. And as we have shared with students in this second module, we will go in depth in the practicality and presented in first person with the stakeholders. So in this first webinar, we will talk about the management and governance of protected areas, shared protected areas. And for this, we have the presence and support of 3 peers from the region, from Peru, Honduras, and Colombia. And so, first of all, thank you, all of you, for your time and good disposition. Marco Arenas from Peru, Alejandra from Honduras, and Camilo Irazzo from Colombia. And them 3 will be joining us today in this webinar, presenting their experiences and their local experiences from each of their countries. Again, thank you. And for the students that just arrived, again, let me advise for you to take note of the different presentations from our colleagues, because this will be very important for your participation in the thematic forum and for the uh, practical work that you will be presenting in terms of shared governance. So in this session, this webinar, I'm going to share the word with the one who is starting it and officially initiate. Thank you, Christina. And also thank you on behalf of the YAPA project from University for International Cooperation for Protected Areas. I want to thank Marco, Alejandra, and Camilo for your good willingness and efforts to join us here today. We have been discussing in terms of governance and good governance in particular, and these things we have to move them and sort of motorize them. And for that, one is required not just the willingness, but also the mechanisms, institutionalized mechanisms that allow to move forward towards good governance. And one of the elements is the sharing, to share the management, the governance, and share those 2 elements that we will be seeing in the different presentations on how are they presented. But today, we will be revising 3 mechanisms developed in 3 countries, 3 different countries, in order to look for that shared governance. And the case that Marco Arenas will be presenting is one of the cases. I don't know if you remember, but the one that was regarding the 8 mechanisms that I closed that presentation saying that there are a couple of mechanisms very important from Colombia and Peru that we're going to be discussing today. And those are the ones that Marco and Camilo will be presenting. Those mechanisms are very structured and well established. And those are the mechanisms that they truly exemplify what is being done in the region. And for example, what's being done in Honduras that have been developed for several years, which is led by ICN from if I don't recall bad, but Alejandra can precise this. And that project promoted those schemes. and also within the Central America region, and several of those countries from Central America adopted those shared governance mechanisms. And since they have been developing, and that's what Hanta will be sharing with us. So for the course, this is very important. These elements are very important because are examples of these mechanisms that have been implemented in countries, different countries that showcase what good governance are, and they have been officialized and structurized within the institutionality. And with no further ado, we will be starting the presentations. Now let's give the word to Marco Arena, which is a good friend. He's Peruvian, great friend from and works with preservation. And I recognize several other peers in Peru, but he has important leadership in the areas of protected areas in Peru, where he um, develops, and he's also in charge of all the social participation. And also, when one goes to Peru, one starts listening about Marco. And so it's an honor to hear about him, and he will be joining us in his presentation, and then he will allow the next presenter. And here, I'm here. He's loading the presentation. Okay, Marco, 20 minutes. If you can please stay within those 20 minutes. Okay, go ahead. Hi, Stanley. Hi, everyone. Hi, colleagues. Uh, with me in this presentation are some peers from the General Direction Production in Honduras. We are working some works regarding the surveillance, and they're joining me here, and they'll be with me for 20 minutes. I just want to thank you all, and for this YAPA project, for allowing for this exercise and this project that we have been working in collaboration with our peers, with the Uni Amazonico. And I also want to thank personally Christina for all the logistical coordination, and Stanley for, well, that's pretty much what I want to share. Because those are the ones that are part of this process, of this development process. and and uh, and as leaders of the development of people towards the territorial management and for protected areas. So I will be sharing with you, and it's not directly related to second layer governance, because that model that we have associated with territorial management, it's more of a second layer. So, but I will be addressing more of the first layer, and that means the daily choices, the day-to-day work, and what works or is implemented on a daily basis. So that's what I will be sharing with you about a tool, a governance tool, let's say, and in the territory, the local territory, and that in the practical matters have been provided good results. Okay, so that we can better understand what the system is aiming for, and the protected areas system in Peru is aiming for. Uh, is aiming to accomplish the mandate of properly managing the protected areas, and that's related to it is possible to preserve biodiversity if the services is flowing in terms of the systemic services. And if that is the case, then people are benefited. If I properly manage that type of ecosystem, the systems flow. So, for example, there's more fish or more waters, people are benefited, and that's why people preserve. If I manage to accomplish that, I'm being effective. and I'm not just having a park. And for that, I have to keep in mind that I have to be clear and have that clarity that I have to provide well-being within the community. And talking about the local population, what I have to accomplish is that the locals sees me as an asset. Because if I don't achieve that, they won't be supporting my activities. But if they see me as an asset, in here on the right, as you can see that lady working, one has to recognize there are several organizations with different levels of governance and assistance and development within the territory. In other words, we have to recognize there are other stakeholders and also understand that this territory is within a preservational polygon. And this ecosystem uh, is within a greater landscape. So one of the important topics that we have been developing in Peru is as related to the focusing on the participation. But here on the right, you can see these sort of ladder on the right, which is a ladder of participation, and it showcases what we are looking for, which is that people not just participate, but also to assume a greater degree of compromise and more responsibilities as a result as the development of joint ventures or activities, working upon a greater participation in terms of decision making, better governance towards shared territories. And that's key. The need for shared territories where there are local population which has granted rights, territorial rights as such. If we do not understand that uh, figure, it's going to be complicated. So one of the key elements on this ladder is how do we look for a greater increment of the population and also their participation. And something that helped us within the territory in this layer, and the mangroves from Tumbres have been called development. Um, and they're been taken as full life agreements that aim for well-being and quality of life and public value. So in Peru, we have had several experiences, conservational experiences, and we have a figure regarding the preservation. For example, in that first layer, we did a administration or management contract, another mechanism for participation, and that second, say, layer, where we look for greater participation. At some point, we will probably be talking about this, and it's something that it's very strong in Peru. We have been attaching to something that it's nonprofit for the administration of a territory. When that someone, uh, indigenous organizations, when they go to the territory per se, they realize they have to make agreements with the local populations, and those communities do commit. Uh, Also, the coverage for vigilance and for economic development in conservation agreements. Where are those agreements? Within the protected areas structure. What we have differentiated, clearly differentiated, is a participation mechanism. Is that is a space for participation, although there are not places where decisions are made. The mechanisms, though, are uh, spaces or pacts or contracts that we submit to agreed upon different commitments. In Peru, we have different spaces that have been able to agree. Machu Picchu, for example, has a participation space where the culture minister and tourism minister, the mayor sitting at the same table, and a representative of the area, and that space is for decision making for Machu Picchu's case. But in reality, we have several contracts with indigenous organizations, which we use for making that decisions. For example, agreeing upon specific conditions. So there's a community or a group of people can assume responsibilities upon some such agreement. So what's an agreement? So we can move forward. It's an agreement. It's a pact between the state or the government and a community or an indigenous community. On my right here, which is the right of the slide, you can see the people from the protected areas and the leader of the territories. And you can see the different stakeholders there. So on the right, you see the representative of the community, and in the green table, you can see the government representative, and also United Nations representative, and also the mayor from. But the ones that are signing the agreements are the three on below that you see with the papers. They're signing an alliance to preserve the protected areas. So that's an management opportunity in relation to this agreement. And that has also to do with the development of an activity, which is the management of the water in the area. This community has, at this point, 98% of protected areas, and that means that they have 2% affected area. So they are actively working to recover that 2% and to preserve that 98%, which is in a relatively big area. So surveillance is very important and it's needed to preserve that 98%. So one of the incentives, or the pact that get that community together, is that conservation agreement. So where's that agreement, that conservation agreement? Who are the stakeholders? Indigenous organizations, a community within a territory or the polygon of that protected area, which has a direct social impact. And that's sort of the mechanism that we implement. So it's not a limitation. No, in Peru, it's an area that is generated to prevent impacts. What we are looking for, it's an area for rural development. And that's the model that we're talking about, kind of like what you can see there. And this next slide is just the ladder of the preservation or conservation, and you can see where the agreements are localized or located. On the right, you can see on the very top, and where on the right and the left side, because through this contract or agreement, which is a document, or agreements are signed for bilateral relationships or relations. So So with the compromise of fulfilling those responsibilities, because if not, there's no point on signing the agreement. So in this letter, what I can see how the responsibilities can be assigned uh, in the different order of relevance. So what we have in this figure, we have a participation mechanism, which aims for well-being and common wealth. And these agreements are developed in this on the second layer, and they allow for strengthening the platform, and in this case, indigenous or passing populations uh, or other stakeholders in Peru, and strengthen um, organizations so they assume the responsibility so that agreement is fulfilled. The responsibilities are fulfilled. So you have within a territory, and you can see or that the agreement looks for or aims for is how can we develop within this model and territory an equality of conditions and to um, uh, assume responsibilities, and also how combine the complementary activities. So the agreement of preservation becomes this mechanism for the stakeholders to commit. Uh, and let me just move forward with the next slide. The mechanism has its own logic, and achieving preservation agreement is not a matter of months. With, for example, with the people that extract shells, the relationship has been bilateral and has been more of like the uh, forest keepers chasing them. But in 2017 and 18, we started establishing a trust mechanism. And after that, we're able to actually start communicating with them and share the responsibility with them, and actually provide to them an agreement for responsible uh, maintenance and management of the area, and the mechanism within their communities are the preservation agreements. And that's what happens also in the Amazonian area with the communities. So in terms of design is crucial because those are trust mechanisms. They are not fast, they take time. And for example, there's another agreement that was just signed with Iberica chocolate. I don't know if you're aware of that. Like La Iberica in Peru is the most important chocolate uh, producer, and this company acquires their the cacao, uh, from a certain area, but now they will be purchasing from the local producers. And so for the ones that want to allocate for the area of Antiti is located, if there are within that protected area, there are some producers which signed an agreement with the sanctuary, in other words, with Eric. And Eric signed with a chocolate company. And what comes as a result is that if Redica acquires chocolate only if they have that agreement, the cooperation agreement. So they preserve the agreement to keep that seal or that guarantee that they are protecting, and they have also to surveil the preserving areas. And in that signed agreement, they can show, and you will get even a better price. So just to exemplify the importance of this type of agreements. So the agreement also allows for a little bit of, say, territorializing the area, and also to connect with the identity of the territory and in the surroundings of a protected area. I think I'm running out of time. Here you can see the potential of the agreement. In terms of design, it's important to define the stakeholders, and it's really important. Um, so the agreement has to be with people that are representative of the areas of interest. The agreement does not grant rights in that happen in Punta Coles, where the preservation agreement, they thought they were granted with some rights, so they thought they were able to access water resources, and they thought they were exclusivity rights granted, which was not the case. So they were using that agreement for that exclusivity because they developed practices of their own in the common space for 1 year. So very fast the impact was noticed, and they thought they were entitled because they were saying, well, I have a preservation agreement, but no, it does not grant that type of right. The agreements are implemented. Let me move forward, and you can see the logic behind it in the slide.
Marco, te queda un minutito, puede ser.
Okay, you have 1 minute, okay? The crucial topic, the impact of these preservation agreements. In this case, well, we have all the protected areas that are delimited there. In front of the area, or the protected area, there's a community or organization, and that uh, uh, to that community, I will be transferring the responsibility so they can also monitor and exercise the surveillance so that they can try to avoid that specific area you can see there, it's impacted. So what has happened is a reduction of the deforestation rate, as you can see. In these communities that have signed off an agreement, they decreased the deforestation rate. And what we have been doing this year, as uh, we awarded the good preservationists uh, unidad or unity, put together a team, and um, which from we are improving the tool with, and that's just one of the examples of, and that's for Iberica. And with that, Stanley, there's other information of the learning lessons that we had. Thank you, Marco. I know it is complicated, especially for a person like you that manages so much information on this topic to be able to summarize in these 20 minutes. So I really appreciate your effort on this matter. Thank you for preparing me. Okay, Marco is of the those type of person that is like those cars with no um, wheel. There's just it's no brakes. He won't stop talking. So, but it's always an honor to be able to talk to Marco about these topics. Okay, so let's listen the experience on Honduras to Alejandra Reyes, which is the director of the protected areas in Honduras, which is also a leader in Honduras and in terms of preservation. I've seen her in other webinars participating on these topic related matters. And also, uh, the people that I've discussed with in Honduras, I've mentioned and provided very good references on of Alejandra. She's a person with a good vibe. She's directing the preservational conversations in Honduras, and she has a lot to say in terms of eco management and her experience in Honduras. Alejandra, please, time's yours, so you can start sharing when you want. Okay. Uh, well, good morning to all of you, and thank you for this opportunity to share our experience. And when I was listening to Marcos, I was taking notes of things that could be ideas, it could be replicated in Honduras in this topic of community participation or communal participation. And also appreciating what platforms have allowed for us in order for us to share our knowledge and experiences in terms of our protected areas. And I will be sharing regarding the experience that we have in our country regarding the share management in protected areas. And I think that we are one of those countries that are really encourage that type of management with the different stakeholders and which also have very institutionalized this matter. We that the word we use is called eco-management within protected areas, which is also known as shared management. If you see the slide, that we are almost in the middle of Central America, and we have around 91 protected areas from where they have um, 74 with which are legally established, and that helps because each of those protected areas is backed by a special law. We also have 17 proposed areas that also have other legal mechanisms for recognition, like agreements. And I like to mention always something which is in this case sad in these pandemic areas, uh, which is that lots of the deforestation that are occurring is within our areas. And I think some of you have seen that precisely through the pandemic times. Um, Deforestation and other impacts have increased. We thought it was going to decrease, but uh, to, it's been really challenging. And in the map, you can see our national system of protected areas in the territory per se. And uh, also when we see this, practically 62% of all this area and say 38% of marine areas or water areas. Now, talking about the eco-management for us this is conceived as a shared mechanism throughout contracts or agreements between the state and different specialized organizations, municipalities, and nonprofits, which guarantee the proper use and management of the natural resources. And that's what has been established by law, uh, which allows for us to uh, agreed upon those types of mechanisms in contracts, and there are already legal guidelines for the eco-management. And here, the government or state is the one that signs. Here in this timeline, you can see that although that are protected areas, the first ones in 93 was recognized, the national system of preservation as a different or separate organization. The first experience, though, that we had was in 92, was the first model for eco-management was established for the uh, Parque Nacional Sumande, and you can see that was the first real agreement that the government got involved in. And this is the movement at a Central American level. And after that, we adopted that type of agreement. And in 1997, it was an important moment because 16 different agreements for eco-management of 32 protected areas were signed. Now we have pretty much over 90% of the protected areas under that same scheme. Um, from the 2000s, we have been establishing the mechanisms of implementation of those agreements. And before that, the protected areas was established by a different law that changed in 2008, which strengthens the faculties of the eco-management. And that's where we can see the laws or the rules, say, with more clarity, which established the participation guidelines. And after that, in 2014, you see more specificity on the agreements and in terms of the evaluations as well. And after these 7 years, right now, we are revising the different guidelines and finding the loopholes. I understand that the other important elements that have been challenging, for example, communal participation in indigenous population integration. It happens a lot in our countries is that the majority of the protected areas also are connected to communal or indigenous communities. And so from a legal perspective, since our constitution, we recognize preservational areas, and there are several articles that mention that in the constitution and also encourage participation, which serves as a guideline or guidance. So based on the experience that we had previous, to, the whole system has been increasing and strengthening and given more empowerment to the National Institution for Preservation of Biodiversity, and also by the establishment of agreements for management or eco-management of the different stakeholders, which grants the foundations for us to expand these mechanisms. Also, the law recognizes or acknowledges the acting of the private sector and other public sectors. And we acknowledge also that we have to make these processes um, open to participation, and uh, also what has to do with granting opportunities of usage for public spaces. And so that we see it, the administration corresponds to the state, but for that we can establish an eco-management system which allows for that coordination and cooperation for the management of natural resources. Uh, and that promotes participation of the different stakeholders within a territory or that may add to the effort or benefit, assist in the effort, or that can be included in this type of figure. We have 65 protected areas which have been declared as such, and from them, 65% are under that mechanism. And we can see when we analyze it, we have 67 agreements, 67 organizations from civil society, municipal governments, which are responsible in the territories and that have integrated under this figure for better communication and integration. And also we have government in 8 government institutions. We also help regulate some of the activities, but also facilitate the work in collaboration because it integrates the efforts so that we can have a common vision on the specific territory and that we can better coordinate and resource and allocate the resources. We have been able to integrate 4 universities as well and 2 private companies, and we have been doing also efforts to integrate indigenous federations, in this case 3. What's the process? We have guidelines for this for subscribing of agreements, and it starts with presenting a request, a formal request to be part of, and then we have a revising process for the different prerequisites that have to do with legal and also the financial capabilities. And when you talk about civil society, this is possible. But right now, we have the challenge to define some of the mechanisms to encourage that communal participation that we know that are not meeting those requisites, but also know that they are doing important efforts and that we can combine or help them join. And then, beside analyzing the competency and based on the management programs, then the consultation process is started where the um, clauses are established, and not just that, but also the operational plan, which is established, and also an action plan when it's not implemented. And something important too, and acknowledging the autonomy that the municipal governments have, is that, and also to support or us, is that we work with the municipalities, one for their integration, and number two, so that they can support the establishment of the organizations, because we need to guarantee that those are organizations that are well recognized and that have experience within the territory. In many of the cases, it's not necessarily related to natural management. Um, uh, but after that, the file is made, and finally the sign off is done in a public act or public manner. And for each one of the steps, we have guidelines and how it's established. And for this mechanism, it is a formal one where the people that integrate to this, although it's voluntary, they do establish a formal commitment to support the management and also submit uh, to the responsibility that the agreement actions are taken. And something also important is to acknowledge that the specific party is not in charge of the whole land, and then we move on. At first, we kind of did that, but after establishing several areas, agreement with several areas, we realized that we needed to change that mindset or perspective thinking that from the evaluation and implementation uh, was just part of it. Now we have evolved the concept, the overall concept of eco-management and adapting it to the actual needs and in terms of planning the communities. And now the responsibilities are established in terms of the programs on the established areas. And we also do focus on the different stakeholders on the specific areas. Mm, so that it's just on say the north sector, and specifically to that on that area I will be addressing the efforts. So this allows for us that each organization with all their strengths can sit in the under one same say umbrella or table and negotiate and agree uh, upon what's relevant. So we do have, differentiated but share responsibilities. And the agreements have number one, common objectives, and number two, other is that none of the parties provide a service, and three, that provides the transparency and credibility, and also the generation, number four, of synergies corresponding to unity or unified vision and objectives and common interests. And what's important of this establishment of agreement is that it allows organizations to generate different efforts with other collaborators or stakeholders. And the institution continues to be well informed about this type of initiatives or efforts on the protected areas. And so for these organizations, it's an opportunity and support from the government to continue with these efforts. And the agreement as such is for 5 years that could be renewed. For example, the protected area that I mentioned since 92 continues to be eco-managing this protected area after almost 30 years. And also important to mention that we have to sit on and talk about the confirmation of a committee for the eco-management for follow-up of the agreement per se, and also the implementation. And when we evaluate or monitor the effectiveness of the management, part of what we evaluate is the management model. And also because the eco-management agreement should answer to the objectives, the preservation objectives of the protected area, and that's what serves as guidance. So when the evaluation is made on the management of the protected area, 60% corresponds to implementation of the management plan, where we have different indicators and different scales, but 40% also, it's equivalent to the evaluation of the eco-management. We have some indicators on how to evaluate and assess through those metrics the level of management, so that we can take some measures depending on the type of planification of the protected area, in order to improve and continue moving forward on the indicators. And that's something very important for us. And in this matter, also it has been important because, like as I mentioned before, we thought that this type of evaluation of the protected area was just an evaluation of the organization, but we are not evaluating individually. We are actually evaluating the common actions and the impact that they're having on the efforts of preservation. And here I'm going to go over this quickly because I have a few time left. Some cases of participation that we have in some of the protected areas. For example, I mentioned the importance it has for us communal or community participation. is the case that we have in the Hombre Riosfera Reserve, which is our greatest protected area because it has different categories of national recognition, but also internationally uh, as a world patrimony. And here, although it's one of the areas that we have the greatest challenges because it's the sector of the country that has more pressure in terms of deforestation and deforestation relating to other legal activities that touch the national security matters. But that's where we have the greatest national resources and also live living culture. So we have indigenous population that are also threatened by different um, things that I previously mentioned. What was happening was like an antagony between the communities and the government, and that took us to uh, actually recognize the rights, the property rights, and although challenges remain, that has allowed for establishing a mechanism of coordination between the territorial councils of the indigenous people and the government, and to recognize those territories within the territories where those councils are. Titles were granted uh, for the councils, the community councils or indigenous communal councils, which is a was a great step forward. And also that allow for alliances to promote preservation and management of the territory. And here we can see how some agreements were established for cooperation with territorial councils of indigenous territories and established some work plans um, for managing the natural resources. And also, as we have been learning, uh, there was a protocol for the encourage the management of the natural areas. We had a cooperation agreement or area in the Colombian territories. In that sense, we've been influenced by other experiences that people in South America have had. There's just 1 minute left, so yeah, we'll speed up. And here we can see how some participation structures have been established. Like I mentioned before, some government institutions, municipalities, and indigenous councils, and so on. And here I just gonna go over this fast, which is a marine park. And here we were able to establish a cooperation agreement where we have a lot of, here so you can see the um, ocean area or the marine area, which is the greatest. And you can see different agreements between the central government and the local governments. And within that platform, we've been able to include some other stakeholders. And we have been able to integrate them and also better coordinate in terms of cooperation and others. And in that case, the responsibility are allocated through the management program or per management program, and each of them has assumed responsibilities in that sense for the management of the protected area. But it also has been a challenge to be able to coordinate because the more stakeholders, the harder to coordinate. But we all know about those type of challenges. But I think the people that are within that system of protected areas understand this. But yes, this is the way to move forward when we work together and unify different sectors and we have clear set of rules. When we allocate those mechanisms on how people can integrate in accordance to our legislations and laws, and although there are governments that have more responsibilities, resources are limited. in the more local participation, the more presence. And it is important to make that revising or revision of the objectives. And I would like to mention that right now, for us, one of the greatest challenges is how to establish those mechanisms for better participation of the indigenous population, communities, youth, and women. We have more practical mechanisms that allows for us to see all the efforts and have better coordination, and also to uh, acknowledge that we have important challenges with the private sector, and that all that translates to have more presence, more coordination, and also in a greater flow of resources for the preservation of protected areas, and also to see that all that our stakeholders are generating is properly communicated and informed to the impact areas of impact. We need good communication, because without it, we cannot achieve anything, and we can be redundant in our efforts, and some other problems generate out of lack of communication. So we want to have a same vision. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Alejandra.
Thank you, Alejandra.
Difícil, poder, sí, difícil resumir en
It's hard to summarize in 20 minutes so much history, 30 years of experience.
sabemos que fue un gran desafío
We know it was a big
hacer esto posible.
challenge to Alejandra, but in any case,
Creo que las puertas están
I
abiertas
think the
para
doors
mayor
are
comunicación
open for more
con
communication,
estos
and
actores que están
eventually with these
también
actors
webinarios. Nosotros vamos a tratar
that
de
are
hacer
presenting in
posible que
the
este
webinars. We will try to
espacio sea
facilitate
abierto
that
a todos y
possibility
también a
so
los
that you
actores
can interact
posteriormente a más
these
adelante.
actors
Gracias, Alejandra, por ese esfuerzo.
or
Les
stakeholders.
paso ahora
So thank you,
a
Alejandro, for that
Colombia.
effort. So now let's move to
Damos
Colombia,
el pase a Camilo,
and
que
let's
nos contará la experiencia
let Camilo to share his experience in Colombia. It's
y
a
también las
passionate
repercusiones a
uh,
nivel
topic, and that
de
it
Latinoamérica este
has
espacio.
had different implications.
Claudio Erasmo.
So go
Camilo,
on, Alejandro.
Camilo.
I'm sorry, Camilo. Thank you all. I want to thank you. Firstly, thank you, and for this participation, sharing this moment with people that are so valuable and with such great experience like Marco, Alejandra, Stanley, and Christina. For us, it's an honor to be able to be here. Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to tell you that Colombia, in its current territorial condition, we have been able to evaluate and gather information that allow us to understand that 70% of our protected areas has a type of uh, interconnection with traditional territory or collective territorial area, maybe the Afro-Colombian areas of indigenous people, or even people that are isolated, and also peasant population, or what we call as mestiz populations. And that means that in our exercise of preservation requires a dialogue and building of agreements, because that governance is only possible by those type of actions. I wanted to briefly mention some of the background and how they evolved and cause how we plan and manage today. So firstly, back in the 50s, Colombia decided to organize its territories in terms of the forestal resources, uh, and it was perceived as something that couldn't be exploded. Um, and from that point on, the first conflicts started to emerge. By the 80s, we 70s, I'm sorry, in the 80s, the first national parks or reserves were created. Parque Los Guacharos here in Colombia and some other protected areas. Which in the 70s, a good amount of protected areas were established, and also the consolidation of the legalization or legality of the, those norms were established. And by the year 1977, we established that it was compatible figure, legal figure of preservation. And back then we were calling them indigenous reserve, but now we know them as uh, ancestry or territory. For the 80s, several of them were established of those protected areas so that indigenous populations could be entitled to some of the land, and so that they can possess the land, and that guarantees rights for them in relation to in contrast to the rest of the population. Also, there was a change in the 90s of the legal framework constitutionally. We moved to widen, more ample constitution with a more pluricultural and sustainable focus, and also in the establishment of rights. And that's why almost all the Colombian structure changed in relation to that, or as a consequence of that. And so did we, as national parks. And we initiated a political instrument for the participation, for social participation in conservation or preservation. So we moved from a topic of just control and surveillance to more of a participation or invitation for the general society to participate in the preservation. Then we saw the first preservation agreements emerge from the 2001, 2002 and on, and they gather possibilities to build the first special regimes, and that's a denomination that this was granted in the 70s, establishing that all the protected areas have a regime, the management regime. But in the case of the areas that have overlapping territories, there's a special uh, red regime uh, that guide them or norm them. Then we had the first establishment of uh, those experiences for REM, and the processes started. The first REMs were very simple. It was mainly an agreement of topics of interest. But now the REMs are instruments of planning and management with all the components, with the diagnosis, with the component of conjuncted agreement and the implementation of strategic actions with the community, along with the community. In 2019, also established an important step because we started constituting new special regimes where now the protection of specific communities was established, and we started talking about territories or acknowledging specific territories and the relation between the communities, the indigenous communities and their territories. Also, other types of populators, which is the Afro Colombians, for example. And with them, we started working on participation plans and collaboration plans, and also in other contexts where we have peasant populations, we also established agreements for participation and collaboration. Here is some stepping points were the adoption of the that REM policy or mechanism. Basically, the exercise of building in collaboration an area for management and with the indigenous population, it requires to see it or set the foundations or start with the foundations that are uh, in that relation. And by this, I mean establishing, granting legal right for them, the communal leaders, uh, so that they can execute or act more of a like a local mayor would do for the actions they take. They also have a tradition and some particular elements for their culture that vary from ethnic to ethnic group, and um, and also impacts the way they exercise the governance of the specific territories. In this case, we have a grandfather of the specific area, and he is a leader, the cultural leader. And so the Guayu population is subdivided to different clans. So the exercise of dialogue is done with different people. But this grandfather or grandpa of the community or elder on the community, once it grows, it starts becoming more and more uh, key in the acting of the community. But also that leadership position varies depending on the territory. But that's to exemplify to what's going on in the communities and the stakeholders and the challenges it has. And this results uh, as a with the construction of an integral diagnosis that allow for us to continue moving forward integrally. And this requires a permanent dialogue and this allows us to build this type of mechanism and relation. Here I can tell you briefly that to date we have subscribed 9 special regimes of or REMs for management, and as a first step, we diagnose and see if it's feasible. And from there, we establish a platform that allows for us to start building the work and the construction of a RAM and between the environmental authority and the indigenous authority. We have agreements for usage management for other regions, for example, the Afro population, but they don't conduct to specific regimes, but to participational plans or special plans. And we also have about 1,700 agreements with past populators, and say they don't have collective property, but they have specific property. So in that sense, we aim for a transitional regime that reduces the stress or pressures that they might undergo. Some of the special cases I also wanted to mention that I wanted to share with here all my colleagues. Here is the Parque Nacional La Macuira, which was created in the 70s. It's located in the more of the northern side of the continental area of Colombia, the Guajira Peninsula. It's a desertic context, about 20,000 hectares, and it's 100% um, combined. So that area uh, integrates with indigenous territory. And from the 1984, some important topics started to be addressed in relation to the protection of water, because there's just one mountain formation that provides water to that desertic area. And from then on, we started building in conjunction some agreements and different instruments, and that allow for us that in 2011 we established an REM, or special regime management for management, and this agreement uh, discusses all the different uh, stakeholders and the way they have organized their territories. And then also the conjunct decisions. And from 2017, the second generation of special regimes, we started a process of updating or actualization of that REM. And by 2019, we subscribe a new REM that is updated and incorporates all the planning and management of the area, and that nowadays allows for us to develop many of the working exercises. For example, they're one of fundamental elements from the Wayuu population is counseling. When someone makes a mistake, the elders call them and make this what's called counseling, and prevents them or warn them, and that person has to fix their mistake, and that has been used for thousands of years, and so it was incorporated into this REM for the decision making, and it's part of the mechanisms that was implemented for the specific communities to address the different challenges and problems they face. We also have instances where the elders from each of these territories sits in a space that we call the Wise Men Council, which is just for elders which is called Alaudayu in their dialect. And within that mechanism, we start making the decisions and year by year, and on that basis, we revise and we agreed upon the amount of resources and projects that we have ongoing, and develop those specific actions in conjunction. We then evaluate and follow up. The other experience that I wanted to mention is a very particular experience for towns from the Sierra Nevada of Santa Marta, located in a very strategic area of the Colombian Caribbean. This mountain is the highest and nearest to the ocean. It has a gradient from 0 to the snow peaks, and traditionally the descendants from the Tairona culture have been living there, and those four uh, um, towns or populations occupy a very wide territory that are landmarked by specific locations, which they call the Black Line, and this territory covers not just the Parque Santa Marta, but the Parque Tayrona and the Flamenco Sanctuary and the area of Salamanca and the Cienega Park from Santa Marta. So there's 5 protected areas within the ancestral territory. The coordination, as for now, has been in relation to the Parque Sierra Nevada and Tyrone one, and it has allowed for us to build a planning agreement, which acknowledges the um, what the traditional population have uh, aggregated to the territory, and in that in 2019 allows for agreed upon the first agreement that foresees 2 protected areas, and this instrument was built in conjunction, but the authorities decided that due to the complexities addressing that area, we should do a previous consultation in Colombia. That is a common mechanism to agreed upon joint measures and other type of initiatives that have impact indigenous territories. In our case, our consultations are differentiator because they are surrounding preservational topics, and so that allowed for us to adopt the planning um, management plan, uh, and and so this has allowed us for make a collaborative effort. We have important advances. The Parque Sierra Nevada of Santa Marta will be expanded and will cover the totality of the indigenous territory, which is not entitled, but it will be uh, made humanity patrimony. And the different points that you see here are the holier sanctuaries or holy places for the indigenous populations. And so this is generating a good environment for to generate a collaborative agreement. The other case I wanted to mention briefly is the case of the national park called Jagoje Apaporis in the Colombian Amazonia. This territory for many years was explored in terms of the possibility of generating a protected area. There are several lakes here which are biologically relevant, very important because they're very particular, but also is in the origin history says that for the indigenous people, tale says that when the world was created, the mother earth cried, and those tears formed those lakes. So it has a mythological origin and also a biological one, which is very important. There are several uh, different ramifications on the river that generate very important biological life and fish life, and it's very particular. There's a transition between the savannas and the forests or jungles. Basically, when the protected area is created, it's a result of the request from the indigenous territories, which are facing very harsh conditions due to the mining activities. So they requested a legal protected area. That work was made since 2007, and then in 2009, the establishment of a protected area was created for the coordination and management. And then mining sector demanded a creation of the area, and the constitutional area ratified the agreement for the protection. And when the court established that would be the equivalent for the is the highest of the courts, and they the highest authority, and they defined a special regime. Uh, and that regime is that combination of rules that allow for the coordination and management, and it has as a foundation the cultural aspects of the people that are in the surroundings, and which are focused on the preservation and protection of the biodiversity, and also the preservation of the cultural values. This has been a stepping stone. Camilo, I'm sorry, 1 minute, please, because allow to give certainty to all the exercise, the legal exercise, not just the decree from the 1977 or what's consignated in the Constitution, and also what's established in the different legislatures that address the topic of the protecting the communities. But this in particular focused the forest management, the park management. It is very important also to show you that this national park is part of a greater territory, which we call the Maruca Cosmica, which is conformed with a series of on sites that are represented in hills, mountains, and so on. And it's part of a greater territory that is protected due to cultural matters, the Jurupari area. And also, it's a territory that is shared with other countries, uh, like Brazil uh, from the Amazonia basin and the different areas there. We subscribed already this special regime in 2019, and from then on, we have been implementing through the teams, the coordination teams, the actions on a yearly base. We develop an agreement for the management of them so that the actions are actually implemented. There's many challenges in terms of preservation and management of the protected areas, but we have been moving forward in conjunction or in collaboration with the communities. And now we have in many of those territories, you know, in Colombia, we have armed conflicts and social conflicts that are very strong, but we have, through the uh, closeness of the relations with the communities, the indigenous communities, we've been able to manage and be present in the more or most complex territories and challenging. So thank you very much, and in anything that I can collaborate with you. Thank you, Camilo. Undoubtedly, the Colombian REMs or REMs from years ago to today, they sound good in Latin America. They resound uh, in Latin America because the transcendence of the mechanisms and what they um, mean. So it's very interesting to listen to the experience and also, in a way, at some point, see some of the details that, for example, I was in La Paya where they were trying to talking about the political agreements and trying to encourage the REM. It was very interesting, the discussion and the vision and the perspective that indigenous territories have. Those details are very important. And however, in this webinar, we cannot cover it all, but that works for the rest of experiences, for Peru experience, and Alejandra, and management scheme they have. It is impossible to have all the details today, but I invite you to contact them out of the course to these people. We're going to leave the contact information for them. And please, I apologize to Marco, Luis, and Alejandra. Uh, if they bug you, I hope for though that they do that. But to be honest, these are they're good examples of this schemes, and we selected you carefully to to share with us. Well, Alejandra is sharing her data as well, so you can contact her. Okay, now we can have some room for questions. I would like to ask you a favor and for the ones that ask and also the ones that answer, so that we can cover the vast majority of questions. Please don't make open comments. We will be using the open forums for that uh, in order to interact between us. But now let's take the opportunity to ask specific questions to the presenters in terms of the processes. Please be specific also in your answers so we can cover the majority of the questions. I ask you, Christina, to please let me know if you see some questions. Yeah, there are several questions here. And so, yeah, let me just go over them. The first I wanted to check and comment to you all is that the presentations and have been shared, and I think we have no problem resharing them with you. If there's an inconvenience with one or we cannot do that, please let us know so that we can properly address them. And also, the session will be recorded, so you'll be able to uh, re-see them. Also, let's see, we have a question from Ariel to the three of you. Have you have had contracts or agreements that have failed due to lack of um, action? Or
Entiendo que por Perú respondería
I
Alejandra,
understand that for Peru,
pero si quiere, Alejandra,
Nadeska will answer. Well, yeah, she's part of the working team for Marco, and she also manages these
disculpe
topics.
para ordenar, entonces le daría primero la palabra a Alejandra
Okay,
si quiere
so
hacer
Alejandra,
comentarios sobre esta
if you have
pregunta.
some comment on this question, I would like to mention that in terms of management, we have had troubles in some areas. At some point, it was a boom that many organizations uh, uh, became part, and but their managing capacities were too weak. And that's part of our learning is that we have to properly establish the prerequisites for the management so that the organizations that get involved are solid or strong and so that they can actually implement because we've had organizations that are just part for a specific time because they're weak and that impacts that protected area. So what are we doing today? We know that solving or realizing that solving problem of organization should not be our concern or problem, but to define clearly the model for the management. So we're looking for organizations that have different strengths and that can actually remain in the project of in managing. So we have acknowledged that we need organizations that are strong and that have capabilities for management in the long run.
Gracias, Alejandra. Nadezhda, ¿quieres
Thank you,
comentar algo?
Alejandra. Melissa, do you want to complement something in the case of Peru? I'm sorry, Stanley. I had to leave the session. What was the question?
Es sobre si hay
It's
casos
about if there are
donde
cases where of agreements
el proceso no ha
where
sido al
the
100%.
process hasn't been successful, if you have had
¿Alguien ahí?
problems. I think Marco is there too. I see him connected. Yeah, he was not going to be able to be part because he's working on something else. Well, I think that maybe not that if not so much if it hasn't worked, but what we have wanted to highlight is that it has been a whole consolidation pathway in terms of the effective working of these mechanisms, as Marco mentioned. One of the most important ones that have been developed in Peru, we have the co-managing model, where there are well, collaborative work by the government and the uh, executors of the contract, which are the representatives of the native communities. This applies to the Amazonia or Amazonian areas because that's where the majority of areas are. And it's been, and we continue to work on that pathway with the framework of strengthening the society's capacities and technical capacities as well. In this case, the state, by the Suriname organization, and also the executors of the contracts from the communities uh, still don't have some of the mechanisms. So all the efforts are uh, in terms of preparing the mechanisms for a better governance that is more team collaborations for all these areas that have a special regime in place and also that reflects the environment of the protected area and also that it takes the in consideration that the resources that are protected also serve the communities that are protecting them. And so the preservation agreements that Marco presented are still being strengthened in terms of the evaluation and follow up under some of the more solid structures that can foresee and prevent that uh, all the objectives in within this alliance can be executed, and that can also be to related to the agreements of planification and the master plan for the protected areas, and it can also respond to the needs of the territory. So we're under that process that because the models are not completely consolidated, but it's part of the journey or this effort. Well, generate these type of processes take 30 to 40 years to consolidate. So it's not a matter of 2 or 3 years. It takes decades. And Camilo, do you want to add something? Well, in the Colombian case, the acknowledgement of the rights, for territorial rights, and it has moved to some very strong political positions in surrounding autonomy and self management, and that has uh, been forced us to expand our dialogue in terms of the way we construct it, and also the topic of reivindication and full autonomy, which has led to a strong dialogue where we believe maximizing that autonomy is in lays in the capacity to be able to get two actors organized. So by that I mean, if I am one of the actors, be able to work in collaboration, and also to acknowledge that some authorities present in the territory, for example, the elder, or that are will contain will remain there, or for example, the keepers of the parks, and the indigenous population as sovereign and owners of the territory. So we have seen the importance of setting those dialogues between those two stakeholders, and we assume the role of the uh, so each represents their party. We don't assume the responsibilities of the indigenous communities, and vice versa. We have had difficulties in terms of the allocation of the year resources, which have been scarce throughout the years, and we've been depending on other collaborations. But little by little, and as we coordinate, we've been able to uh, collaborate into in order to manage the interest topics, but we also look for resources that are needed to face these troubles or challenges. Okay, other question that I think it's in line with this that Marcia Franceschini asked from Brazil, if in these three cases, for anyone that wants to answer, is there's are instruments or mechanisms that facilitate the intercultural dialogue with indigenous people for the agreement creation. I think it was briefly mentioned, and also a specific question regarding the confirmation of the teams, if they're interdisciplinary teams, or because in Brazil there are several challenges due to the different languages or dialogues and cosmovisions and so on. So I don't know if you have some comments on that. Well, let's start with Nadesa, and let's also ask you to please in 30 to 40 seconds to answer, because we have several, we have short time. Nadesa, please. Stanley, I'm sorry. Can you please ask the question again? Well, Marcia was asking from Brazil, is that do you have mechanisms that facilitate the intercultural dialogue with the indigenous population for the participation on the agreements, and if the teams for the parks, because in the case of Brazil, there's language constraints or challenges, and also the cosmology, cosmovision challenges. Okay, thank you for the question. Well, to facilitate the intercultural dialogue, one of the ways or one of the mechanisms that is giving us best results is that these communities is a management committee that we have in the protected national areas, which is the space of participation, the most important one that we have, independent, regardless the category. Part of these communities, the idea is to collect first the voice of the communities. And so if you have meetings that are previously planned as part of these committees, and with are conformed with more thematic and strategic ways and in accordance to the different needs and agreements. Uh, some topics that can be defined, or like the strengthening of the areas and allocation of resources and so on. And this can facilitate the communication and also understand what the communities are thinking, and also escalate their participation in the dialogues. And also, I want to mention that in the communal reserves, this co-management model, we consider that empowers the dialogue, and it's oriented on efforts that we previously mentioned in the reserves in Peru. All both the state and the communities represented in these type of agreements tend to make decisions regarding the protected areas and the management and protection. This representation and the communication nexus, um, in terms of the can allow for the parties to collect their doubts and their questions and the participations, and that can be escalated to greater communicational level in order and for the representatives to better decide. And now we're making some efforts in the case of Peru that using some guidance so that we can transversalize the intercultural effort in the planification processes. So based on that, we are working on these um, topics, and within the organization, we have a series of mechanisms to work on this matter, and also on the efforts that we have more representation uh, from the different stakeholders, and in order to improve also the communications and also to assume the responsibilities and that we can that we have with, in relation to the area. So thank you. When you have that guidance, please share it with us. And Camilo, I don't know if you have something to add or if you want to share with something, Camilo, regarding the question, or let's say that in the Colombian case, the dialogue starts with agreed upon what are we protecting or preserving, and that is not just an institutional vision, but also the work in collaboration with the communities, what we normally know as area preservation objectives, or reason of being, or the reason of uh, the existence of the area. When we talk about the objects of the preservation, we're talking about priorities or elements of um, collaboration, collaborational efforts. We then can talk about, for example, the flora and fauna or sanctuaries, and that's when it becomes more and more important, those topics, because it's not just for the organization but for the communities, because of they do have a natural instinct preserve or protect. In terms of the intercultural dialogue, yeah, of course, we have protected areas teams that are conformed by indigenous personnel, which is always supporting the permanent dialogue and also translation with the different for the different
Muchas gracias.
communities. And
Alejandra.
thank you, Camilo. Now, Alejandra. I think that the questions are kind of like thesis questions. These are kind of like the not so much the daily questions that we address. But for us, one of the main challenges for the past year is the base precisely this topic of working with communities. We have moved forward in terms of acknowledging that in each process we need to take in account the participation of the communal process. And in these resources, um, Bernardo, Bernardo,
No, es que se oye tu voz haciendo cosas, no sé. Okay, okay.
those part of the works in the area and that have been needed to integrate in the process. One of the great learnings that we've had is that we've had to build protocols and specific plannings, specifically for the different cosmovisions and norms, and that has been very interesting for us. And that's been the pathway that we should need to continue doing and understand that the cosmovision of the indigenous populations for the development of them, and they're very important to take in consideration for us to get close to them and establish those coordination or coordinating mechanisms for dialogue and participation. And like Stanley said, it is not something that occurs from one day to the other. It's a more of a step by step that one has to take, and for each protected area works differently, same wise with different indigenous populations. So there's no general rule, but as I mentioned, for us, it's very necessary in our general norms to establish uh, mechanisms of participations with the communities and also with indigenous populations.
Muchas gracias, Alejandra.
Thank you, Alejandra. Cristina, some of the questions that we have here, we have several. I'm not sure we will be able to address them all, but ones that have to do at least with the main challenges that some of our colleagues have asked in that regards. Also, in terms of yeah, challenges uh, uh, or are mentioned in some of the presentations. I'm not sure we can address them now, but there's one asking if you have had experiences in the eco management that's so successful um, that you have had with indigenous populations,
Se
with
escucha abierta para
a
preguntas.
non-indigenous population or civil population, some uh, case studies or successful cases that you can mention. Yeah, we've had, and let me refer to an experience we've had with communities which are non-indigenous but are in charge of the water management. Within our organization, we have what we call tips of water or spheres of water, which are in charge of the managing of the water resources. We have a protected areas which is very close to the central district, and the ones eco-managing are it's our associations for protected areas. We have over 30 of them, which are handling the water and are also in charge of the protection. And we have seen that it's very effective because it's not just about the government anymore, but we also are seeing the communities involved. And for us, it's been a very successful experience. That's why I mentioned it's important for us as well as this experience to promote them to expand throughout the territory because these are very effective mechanisms for protection as well.
Gracias, Alejandra. Ese tema de
Thank you,
las
Alejandra.
culturas es hermosísimo.
This topic in
Es
the
una experiencia
uh,
de gestión
water
comunitaria, de gestión de autoridades locales.
management is a very, very interesting
Recomiendo que le pidas más
topic.
Alejandra,
I recommend you to
para
ask
especificar
more information in that
cómo,
regard.
cómo se maneja. Marco,
Hi, Stanley. Marco,
¿querías complementar también para el caso de Perú?
do you want to mention something for Peru? Yes, and
Tenemos,
also to precise some
tenemos poco
matters.
tiempo, Marco, entonces
We have little
adelante,
time, Marco, so
adelante, Marco.
please be concise. Yeah, let's see, just in Ida's case, these contracts that are generated in the administrations are with nonprofit organizations, and what's related to these. The last question. In many of the cases, are the agreements are made with organizations not necessarily originary from the territory, but they manage the products that they are developing, and they're basically parts of the strategic lines of the general master plan. It does not grant rights. In terms of the commercialization of carbon, it does grant some rights for the commercializing of some of the services, but in terms of the resources that are managed in these contracts are invested in the protected area. Totality, there's no profit. So that's part of the exercise we're making. That was all that I wanted to mention. Thank you.
Okay, pero Marco,
Okay,
sobre
but
el tema
Marco,
de
in
bancos
terms of
históricos
the topic that they were
y
asking about, yeah, you mentioned it.
entonces, Camilo, además de
So,
los
Camilo,
rems que se hacen en
besides the REMs that are made in Colombia with originary or autochthonous or indigenous populations, is there any other examples? Yeah, we have examples with peasantry populations, but in this case, we're talking about singular titles or singular properties because the agreements in these cases are made with specific families that own a specific portion of land. And with them, we agreed at a preservational contract or agreement. And because uh, this type of property has different challenges because there's some, it's not necessarily compatible. There's also cases where we work with outside areas, establishing sustainable systems and with the communities. And these types of community contributes to the protection of the protected areas uh, from buffering exercise. There are also agreements with the communities that participate with in spaces of the construction and diagnose of the protected areas. And before continuing, I want to ask an important question. How do you operate or how to, this is not the reality in all the countries, but how to successfully obtain these governance agreements in conflict situations or internal conflict situations, conflicts that you have been seeing for many years internally? Well, I would say alliance with the communities, that role that national parks play in the territories that in many areas is the only one appearing or participating in those communities have acknowledged the work of the different communities. And so in many cases, the park keeper becomes key. Uh, participant, and also in order to understand the different parts of the conflict, and how to act on behalf of the communities. And also the mission of the preservation, it's a mission that transcends the political views and so on, because it impacts the whole population. So when you take that with a coherent discourse, uh, it has been very impactful, positively impactful for the communities, because they acknowledge that it's a general effort on behalf of the whole population. But of course, it's not easy. We've had very critical moments. We have had colleagues that have died under struggle for preservation of these protected areas, because and this can be high risk endeavor. Yeah, I want to highlight that because in many occasions we complain about our realities in terms of how hard it is to work on this type of efforts, because we don't have enough resources or money. But when we're talking about life threats, and I want Camilo to remind us, if you do, the amount of colleagues that have died while working. I remember there was a place where there were even pictures of them, but I don't recall well. No, Stanley, I don't have the data here, but historically several peers have died in the exercise of their role. We are currently labeled as victims of the conflict, and we are presenting our reports for the Special Justice for Peace. And there we've seen a clarification of the circumstances that surrounded our peers' deaths. Uh, Especially in this topic that is so noble, which is preservation, and not as part of some other illegal activity. So we are looking for that acknowledgement and the possibility to find the truth, which is the element that would heal and help in the peace process. And on the other hand, preservational areas are areas for the building of peace and development. Thank you, Camilo. It's a harsh experience, and uh, when a peer of us dies, and we're communicated that our peers does not have gasoline, and we're willing to say, collaborate, but then we're warned that we can die. So it's very sad, because one thing is to say it and one thing is to experience it. Stanley, I'm sorry, Libarbo. Yeah, just to help Camilo, we currently have 17 deaths registered. We have one that is out of the country. We have delivered deaths in all the levels of the administration of protected areas. And just to reinforce what Camilo said, that we have presented an form or report to the peace mm, organization. And so it was just to mention that. And yes, I agree with Camilo and what you are mentioning. It's a sad reality. Cristina, okay, thank you all. As Latin American and all my peers uh, for that are working for the preservation, and they are a lighthouse for all of us to show us how to work, and also with a great joy, and from my heart, thank you all. Okay, so following a little bit more on the questions, we're going to extend a bit, and from now I want to apologize because we won't be able to address them all. Oh, like the were orienting questions and technical information so that it was focused on the learning objectives of this. And so I just want to thank you for even the extra time that was involved here. Thank you very much. And just I take note of the rest of the questions that remain unanswered, and I will be sharing them with you through WhatsApp. And if you can please just make a small audio that we can share in the group because there were emerged there were some interesting questions that were asked there. For all the participants, thank you very much for your participation, your active participation, and the interesting questions. Oh, picture. How can we open cameras for a picture so that we can
Con
keep the
con los ojos cerrados.
record? Please open the cameras. Okay, so let's smile, and I think we're gonna have to make two screenshots. Okay, please all smile and keep this smile. Like he just say, I'm gonna take a screenshot. Say whiskey. Okay, keep smiling. Governance.
Eso suena ya.
Marco, queremos verte.
Ahí
Marco
está.
está en
Está
estado
lejos.
de.
Lo que pasa es que entraba a un taller
Okay,
comunitario.
we're waiting for Marco, but he entered a communal workshop.
Estuvieron escuchando los
So
compañeros de
his
la comunidad también.
presentation was heard by
Y ahí
another
está conectado por
peers,
ahí. Está
other
bien, bueno,
peers.
gracias, Pau. Entonces, bueno, solo
Thank you, Paul.
para los
Just to
participantes
the
de Untitled
participants for the
Chapter,
course,
entonces
please
está
take
disponible
into
para
account that as soon as we have the recording, we will give it to you and share it to you. Same wise line with the presentation, so you can participate in the forum and so you can follow up. Uh, we're starting the fifth week on module 2. So once again, thank you very much. And we close here. And a big warm hug for all of you. Christina, I asked you I wrote to you something in the chat. Okay, I'll check it out. Thank
Gracias a
you.
todos.
Thank you all.
Gracias a todos.
Thank you. Thank you all. Okay, bye.
Profesor Stanley,
¿Sí?
profesor Stanley, es que le quería, no sé si un minuto ahí de su
I
valioso
I
tiempo.
don't I wanted to
Digamos,
ask you
conmigo que
just 1 minute of your
esto
time.
fue de todos los ejercicios
Just one
latinoamericanos
season where all the Latin American efforts
claro, para nosotros y como lo
to
mencionaba
us and like Camilo was mentioning,
Colombia
Colombia
tiene unas particularidades
has
dentro de
specific
nuestra cultura.
particularities or singularities within the system, and that in a
Yo
way,
soy personalmente de los que digo
I
que
am
en todos los
the ones
sectores
that
de la
says that in all the
economía no ha
sectors or
sido
areas
una
hasn't
persona,
been,
digamos,
say,
consecuente, digamos, con el propósito inicial. Inicialmente
consequential with
fue
the
más
initial purpose, especially
las áreas
because
que
of the
usted está hablando. Pues
ways that
digamos que
through
más de, no sé, yo
the
diría
ways
que
the
son
mechanisms
como
were in
unas
play.
20.000
And
familias que
we
están
have
alrededor
about,
del
for
mundo,
example, about
que están al interior de
20,000
darnos
rural families
resultados más innovadores también en un ejercicio que no nos
in an
compete
exercise
en
that doesn't
términos
compel
reales,
us
sino
in
que
real
buscar
terms.
la
We
salida
have
de
to look
de
for
las áreas.
exit for the
Podría sonar
local
no sea
peasants or
positiva, sino
uh,
no es fácil o habría que
uh,
ser obviamente
so
más
what way
innovadores
could we
desde
do,
lo
or should we have to be more innovative in terms of
sin
legality?
embargo, yo he mirado la
I've
posibilidad y hemos
seen the
hablado,
or contemplated the possibility with members of a group I belong, and it's we're trying to how to create a token that could impact all the protected areas and be capable of attracting resources to sustain first needs of those rural societies where we traditionally have been struggling with. Why to exclude from the areas the rural communities that have good knowledge of the resources that in one way or the other is patrimonial? How do you see that possibility in the sense of that through that uh, coin or token, you could negotiate it in a sustainable and healthy, clean way so that the state can uh, have communities that generate some profit through preservation of the natural resources. I don't know if you've seen that or if it's possible or if it's even uh,
Vamos a ver si logro comprenderlo, pero cuando se refiere a
mm,
una moneda, se refiere a un
possible. So let me
medio
see
de
if I
transacción.
understand. If you're
Cualquier
talking
medio de
about a coin
de hacer una
or
gestión
token, you're talking about some
en un
sort
lugar
of
donde
a
no hay
transactional
protección absoluta,
enabler,
igual que mi país,
specifically to the
nosotros tenemos
territory that
tengo, digamos,
keeps
unidades
functionality,
básicas
and at the time that's you can also cover
no hay
your
ningún tipo de
uh,
reconocimiento
basic needs. You can get a
financiero.
specific acknowledgement on financial from a financial standpoint. Uh, yeah. In other words, that the activity of preserving is acknowledged as some noble activity, and that has the recognition that like any other honest activity has, so that anyone that wants to preserve has access to that and perceive the say basic income.
Hoy decimos que
Well, today we
preservación
say that
es
preservation is a
y este propósito
multidisciplinary
está
process, and that question that you
relacionado
make is in that direction because now we're starting
y este es un
entering
tema
the
que
economy
yo no soy
topic, and
especialista,
that
no soy experto en ese tema, pero
I'm
sí sé que,
not.
por
It's
ejemplo,
not an area of my expertise.
existen ya hoy en día
I know
mecanismos
that
para hacer ese
currently we
reconocimiento.
have
Uno de ellos, por ejemplo,
mechanisms for that acknowledgement. For example, the origin certifications,
donde se usa,
where
por decirte algo, yo recuerdo haber
for
visto una
for
historia
say for example, I remember in
de la
seeing in Italy,
bueno,
I'm talking
hace
about
muchos años
back in
atrás,
1992,
en un parque que se llama Los
in a
Abruzos,
park called the
uno de esos
Abruzos.
parques tiene
They had some of the
categorías horribles, ni siquiera
autochthonous
y el parque tiene una
species.
certificación del
They
ORSA.
were providing an
Entonces, todos los productos
ORCSO
que se comercializan en
certification.
el parque tienen la certificación del ORSA.
And so all the products made within the park had that
Ese producto. Y eso
quality
beneficia,
certification,
realmente posicionarlo y
environmental quality
conseguir
certification. So they
un mayor dividendo
were
y esa
encouraged
ganancia
to
es
keep that certification because they were paid more,
en
uh,
ese sentido.
and that allowed
Porque el
for more
parque promovía que la gente
competitive prices.
comprara
And so
productos
in that sense, the park was
sencillo,
promoting for tourists
creo yo
to buy those type of product, certified products.
que estuvieran anuentes a pagar un poco más.
And in that sense, so
Ese
that
es un ejemplo. Hay
for them
muchos
to
ejemplos
be willing
a
to
lo
pay
largo
a
del
bit
mundo.
more.
Pero eso implica una cosa,
However, that
son áreas de
uh,
control. Trabajar
requires, in the
con
specific
todo
case of
el
Colombia,
económico,
to work with all the
desde
financial
la lógica de la
systems or
negociación
financial
y cómo se
realm
seleccionan las cosas.
in terms of
Esa es una
how the
cosa que
things
ustedes
are created and promoted.
en Costa Rica
For example, in
tienen
Costa Rica,
cosas más baratas, aunque sean
we fight a
similares,
lot with the state because
era producción que tenía
of
problemas
the
contaminantes.
poor
Pero
spending of the state.
lo más importante era la selección.
But as it turns out, the most important criteria for the state was just
Si no,
price,
ustedes
even in
tienen
detriment of
claro, se pueden poner
quality.
un montón de pasivos ambientales, pero
So
la producción desde el punto de
if
vista financiero es
you
rentable.
just only take that in
Ahora, ¿cómo
consideration,
se
well, yeah,
negocia? Se negocia en
financially,
dos
it's
sentidos.
more effective to
Se
use
negocian los costos,
the cheap materials or not
pero tiene
so
que tener un
sustainable ones.
costo también.
So in that sense, you have
Entonces,
to
¿eso qué
include
ofrece?
other different types of criteria when
Asesoría,
considering financial
tienen,
efforts.
tienen la posibilidad
I don't
de
I don't have that possibility to give you all the options, but those mechanisms actually exist, and certifications are one of them.
fabricación en cadena de producto,
Certification in
pero
production
automáticamente el
chains.
responsable de mejoró mi audio.
I
Y
turn off the
luego la
camera due to
certificación
connectivity
en
issues, but in
Ecuador
Ecuador and here in Argentina, they have mechanisms for compensation mechanisms in the within the framework of the protection law. So the preservation efforts are included there as part of the state investments or government investments. In case of Argentina, the priority forests are included, where you can uh, apply deforestation. So in that sense, the government pays annually from funding, so the owners can apply for preservation. So the complaint of many other owners are complaining that they are not logical to the reality of the markets and are compatible with um, uh, the deforesting and using the actually exploding the terrain for. So in those types of areas, you cannot do farming because within the Argentine society, through this law and this process, they defined these territories of commonwealth, and they cannot be transformed in other use that is not other than the forest preservation. So the government, what it does is to try to at least aid a little in terms of the funds. But for is the programs for the social forest in Ecuador, I don't know the name they have currently. Perhaps it varied, but those are models where the state invests as part of their public budget um, for preservation, because now it sees it as not as an expense but as a investment, because at the end they sustain the different processes of production. That scheme, the compensation scheme, for example, has two sides of that coin. So one is the payment for environmental services. I have a property and I get paid for preserving it, and that comes from a tax on the fuels. And the logic is that if you're contaminating through fossil fuels, in a way, I'm also mitigating that contamination. So there's a 3% that is allocated on the price of the fuels, and that goes to a national bank uh, for preservation of forests. And so it's paid about it pays about $70 per hectare a year. So it's kind of like the environmental service. And also there's a different scheme that is applied in the state of Amazons, and it's a compensation for limitations of the access to development. So communities that are within protected areas, which possibilities are limited for the transformation of a protected area, precisely for the category they're in, the state provides reimbursement that has to do that it's in line with the family, another line for the community, for example, and other that, if I'm not misremembering, that has to do with uh, 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 feeding guarantee or food guarantee. So there's no payment for a service. It's a compensation for society that can generate a lot of capital because it transforms the national resources, and let's say they live in the different conditions through the taxes, as Christina was saying, that transfer to societies that have less possibilities to generate capital. Those are mechanisms that exist also. The problem is that they require political will at higher levels, at a state level or country level. But yeah, the mechanisms exist, and they're very interesting experiences in different countries. Okay, thank you, Professor Sente, Christina. Thank you.